So I'll just quickly start by thanking Russ for the invitation to come and present here in such esteemed company. So we're now into the next session. I think we might be running a bit behind schedule. So we're moving on to a session on master athletes. A lot of the first slides, fortunately, have already been introduced by other speakers, so I can skim over them. And I'm going to show some of our older data and then lead on to some of the new data that we have in master athletes compared to frail older people. So I don't think we need this definition, but we'll get a quick recap anyway. When we talk about a motor unit, we're talking about both nerve and muscle tissue. So every single fiber that's innervated by a single axon is part of the same motor unit. And the definition we have for this is around 100 years old, and we still use it. And one of the best methods we have for studying motor units is electromyography. And there are a few variations of this. High density EMG is fairly recent, and there's some fantastic work coming out with that. One of the better established is intramuscular EMG, so slightly invasive. We use a very small needle, or a pin electrode, as we prefer to call it. Highly well tolerated. It allows us a close-up view of muscle, so we can assess action potentials occurring deep within the muscle. We can assess deeper muscles, and also importantly to us, we can get through the subcutaneous layer that we often see in older people, particularly around the thigh muscles. And we can see an ultrasound image, the tip of the needle and vastus lateralis there, around 50% of the way of the depth through. And we can also use multiple needles if needed, in addition to high density electrodes as part of our standard protocol. And as I said, this allows us a very close-up view of single motor unit activity. So this is a raw EMG trace. Even before we start to export into analysis, we can already see activity of individual motor units. So each one of these spikes will represent the depolarization of all fibers within the recording range of an electrode within that motor unit. And there's a lot of information that we can go on and take out of this extract from it based around the structure and function of motor units. So just to recap on some of the basic physiology, with the depolarization of an individual fiber, we get an individual muscle fiber action potential that propagates along the fiber. We can't measure these directly, but what we can measure is the ion exchange in the extracellular fluid around muscle fibers with an appropriately placed electrode. And this is an example of an overly simplistic, perfectly healthy young motor unit. Each of the muscle fiber action potentials summate to generate a single motor unit potential. And this is our textbook motor unit potential. If we compare that to something a little more complex, so we have neuromuscular junctions that are spread more axially across the muscle, and we have variations in the propagation speed of action potentials, the motor units become more complex. And there are a few measures we can take from this, the variability in times of individual fiber depolarizations. We can also use variations of this method to try to estimate the number of motor units in humans. And a lot of the human data does strongly hint towards a progressive loss with aging. And this is for multiple methods. One of the first papers, which is far from perfect, and I show this for largely a historical perspective as it really did lead the way. This is from spinal cord sections. And this figure is taken originally from the paper, but we have age along the x-axis here, and we can see from the age of 60 we start to see a progressive decrease in the number of cell bodies. With electrophysiological measures, we've done similar work with a primary interest in the vastus lateralis, and again, highly variable method, but we do see a progressive loss, clear differences between young and old people. Importantly for us, these were recorded from what we certainly refer to as healthy non-sarcopenic. None of these people had any symptoms of clinically relevant neuromuscular dysfunction. So again, this does point towards a loss of motor units, possibly preceding clinically relevant losses of neuromuscular function. So what about master athletes? That is what the talk is about. And I have some text here that we kind of use in a lot of our papers. I've probably stolen it from somewhere else, but it kind of sums up. We like to study them. They're an extreme group to study, but they also offer this potential to examine the effects of aging completely disassociated from the effects of disuse. you could go a little further and say that when we're studying aging, we're actually studying inactivity. It's probably a combination of the two, and master athletes allow us to exclude this factor. So we're studying aging only with these guys. We can also quite easily put them into very defined groups based on their ability, based on the age-graded performance, and this gives us a number to slot them into nice, comfortable groups that we can compare. And as physiologists, we like everything to drop into a clear-cut group. We also know that regardless of the level of activity, with increasing age, performance does decline, and this is true of any athlete. They do get worse with age. In terms of motor unit number, we've assessed this in athletes, both in young and old, with the idea being that perhaps younger athletes are predisposed to have a greater number of motor units, and the preservation might occur with lifelong exercise. But that isn't what we found. We found that regardless of activity level, so even in endurance and power athletes, again, highly variable, but all of the old groups were similar. So it's suggestive of a motor unit loss in master athletes as well. And these guys really were high achievers. So age-graded performance of 80 and 85%, so close to world records within their age group, within their discipline. I would add also that this should be taken as an index relative to the total number of motor units, and certainly not a true anatomical count. It should be approached as a reference. Counting motor units just simply isn't possible in humans. But all is not lost, because we have this process of collateral sprouting, collateral reinnervation, whereby once motor units are lost, surviving axons can sprout new branches and rescue these recently denervated fibers, these orphaned fibers. And that largely acts to preserve fiber number and to preserve total muscle size. It also helps explain some of the fiber type grouping that we've already seen already. Here we can see fibers from an older person, completely surrounded by fibers of the same type, and it's much rarer to see these in younger samples. So it points towards axonal sprouting motor unit remodeling. And of course the alternative is that we have motor unit loss and denervation without this collateral sprouting, and we get fiber loss, which contributes to overall muscle atrophy. There is an increasing amount of evidence pointing towards greater reinnervation capacity in older athletes, and this is coming from numerous methods in humans now. I think some of you in the audience will be familiar with some of these images. In older athletes, a greater level of fiber type grouping, again pointing towards greater capacity for reinnervation. And the same in older females, greater grouping in master athletes compared to frail elderly. We've also applied electrophysiological measures to show an enlarged size of motor units, of motor unit potentials and motor units in older people, with an even larger size in master athletes. So this is suggesting that the expansion of a motor unit is greater in the master athletes. And we've done this in two muscles in two different cohorts. So this is from tibialis anterior, from a middle to older age group in both males and females. We see a progressive increase in the motor unit size. So this reinforces a lot of the histological data and shows that master athletes are probably favouring this and potentially delaying this, denervation without reinnervation, and improving the capacity to expand and reinnervate. But we don't really know how this translates to function. If you tell a master athlete that they have larger motor units, the standard answer is, well, what does that mean? Does it mean I'm going to be faster or stronger or better? They don't really care unless it's related to something functional. And force steadiness is quite a good functional measure. It's very simple, very effective. And this illustrates it quite well. The blue line is a simple force trace. We give people a target line to hit with an isometric contraction, and we measure how well they can hold that. There is a learning effect to it, but it's quite small. But everybody gets a go beforehand, and then they give it their best shot. Typically for younger people, they can hold this target line quite well, and it corresponds with similar multi-unit activity. If we compare this to the older guys, it's difficult to hold this target line corresponding to multi-unit activity we could only describe as sporadic, even before any analysis occurs. So each of these spikes represents a single multi-unit. We see a complete drop-off in activity here, where forces corresponds with a loss of force. So it is typically worse in older people. And we can assign a number, coefficient of variation, so we can put numbers to this force steadiness, with larger numbers being worse force steadiness. And at this point, I'd like to introduce another group, and these are perhaps the guys that we should be studying at the other end of the spectrum. So these are frail older people, and we define these based on the frailty phenotype. These aren't the guys that respond to our adverts to come in and volunteer for studies. These have to be brought in by clinicians. So physically, neuromuscularly, they're in a much worse condition. And unsurprisingly, with measures of force steadiness, we see they are much worse than both the old and the athletic old. And we also see that the athletic old, these masters endurance athletes, are better than the old at performing these tasks. And we don't really know why. It seems obvious at first glance, they're more active, but why does that improve to functional outputs such as this? So one of the other measures that we can take from intramuscular electromyography is Neofiber potentials, also often referred to as single fiber electromyography. And by measuring consecutive observations of the same action potential, we can get estimates of how well this neuromuscular junction is communicating, how well the axon is communicating with the muscle. And this is one of Eric Stahlberg's classic measures. It's around 30 years old now, and it is used quite often clinically. I've lifted this image from one of Dave Arnold's papers, this one here, that's actually been done in rats. So we all know it's very difficult to get rats to do voluntary contractions, so they stimulate muscles. And this first peak is the point of stimulation. This second peak is our individual single fiber action potential. And we see the variability in the timings of these peaks. And we can even see at one point it fails to fire. And this is largely because of a failure of this communication point. Because we can't do that in humans, or really we don't want to do that in humans, nerve stimulation in humans is highly non-specific. We don't really know what we're stimulating, where in the pool of motor units we can stimulate. So we use two individual fiber peaks and we align at one peak. So even these traces, we can see that this comes from one single fiber and this the other. And this is a good example. Very little variability across consecutive discharges. And all of this has occurred over about the course of 1.5 seconds. So we typically do this over at least 10 seconds to get more. Consecutive shapes here are a little bit more variable. We can see differences in the shapes, which suggests some kind of disruption or instability at the neuromuscular junction. And to show that a little bit clearer, here we have two clear peaks from depolarization of individual fibers. If we align at one, we can see the second peak is highly variable in its firing time. Just to highlight the sensitivity of that, each of these boxes is around 1/5 of a millisecond. So even over subtle differences, it is observable. So how does this compare with our athletes? We know we're always interested in the neuromuscular junction, particularly in athletes. And again, higher values mean more instability. Big number is bad. Unsurprisingly, we see the old frail with quite high instability, followed by the old, and again followed by the athletic old. Worth noting again that these old are quite healthy. They're certainly in no cause for concern, but still the athletic old are better. It will be useful now if I could align this with some of the images from Richard where he showed partial fragmentation of the neuromuscular junction. And that might explain why we do see some level of instability here. And just a reminder of what it is that we're measuring. These are the good guys. Repeat observations of the same units of 3 fibers here contributing to that potential. And it's repetitive, the same shape over and over again. Compared to something more variable, we align on one fiber, align at one fiber here, and what we see in the other is highly variable. And sometimes we see it doesn't fire at all, and this line is flat. So just quickly to summarize, although we can't see any evidence for the preservation of motor unit number, there's certainly multiple benefits, and this evidence is now coming from humans, of enhanced re-innovation capacity. And this is a figure we've used fairly recently. This evidence comes from humans, from fiber type grouping in human biopsies, electrophysiological parameters, estimates of multi-unit size, and numerous histological markers. And hopefully, we're still in early days with these data, we can add a greater stability of neuromuscular transmission to that list. And with that, I'd like to make a number of acknowledgements. Most of this data comes from previous position, largely the brainchild of the late, great David Jones. And thank all of you, and particularly the British Masters Athletics Federation, who help us with athlete recruitment. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.